When I was 13, the dawning of a new millennium took place on New Year's Eve. While people were fearing the worst with the Y2K bug or out partying and drinking, I was home alone. In 1996, my parents had split up, and from there they divorced, and my mother and I moved across the country from Oregon to Tennessee with her best friend. On the eve of the year 2000, I was home alone, and my mother was currently out of state. Now this didn't worry me, as this was not the first time. I often came home to find a note on the kitchen counter saying that they had gone to Florida for a few days and that there were groceries in the fridge. Since the divorce, she was habitually leaving me alone for long periods of time to go to Florida. We lived on a relatively quiet road, surrounded by trees and set a few miles out of town. And I knew most of the people, if not by name, then by face enough to wave and have a small chat with. And I had never been before given a reason to be afraid of being alone. On the night in question, I was staying up late watching television. I remember I was watching the movie His Bodyguard on the USA channel, and I had most of the lights on in the house. Not because I was afraid, but because at 13, I wasn't concerned with the electricity bills or even saving the environment. I felt completely safe and protected within my little bubble of home. As I was watching the movie, I kept hearing these weird sounds outside, but I remember thinking it was probably the neighbors. Though they weren't extremely close, a couple of them were having a party or people over for the holiday. About halfway into the movie, however, the power in the house suddenly went dead. I sat on the couch for a minute, just sort of in a panic daze, because it was near midnight and pitch black. I remember thinking the power must have gone out and that it would come back on, so I just decided to sit on the couch with my blanket and wait. A few minutes passed by when I heard a noise in the kitchen where the back door is. My heart started racing in my chest because I thought it sounded like the back door being shut. The back door sits just off of the dining room, which is connected to the kitchen, and leads directly into the living room where I was currently sitting on the couch. A few seconds passed after I heard the sound, and I was straining my ears to pick up anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Every noise suddenly felt magnified. When footsteps sounded on the floor, I immediately slithered off of the couch onto all fours, crawled around the ottoman, and started as slowly and as quietly as I could make my way toward the space between the love seat and the couch. I knew I could fit under the side table and be completely hidden by the dark in the ottoman from playing hide and go seek in the dark many times with my friends during sleepovers. I was nearly there when the footsteps became more apparent. I knew from the sound of them that whoever it was making their way through the kitchen now toward the living room. They weren't hurried or anything, it was just like they were moving around in the kitchen. I glanced up from where I was crouched on the floor, and to my horror, there was a dark silhouette standing in the archway between the two rooms. To my credit, I didn't scream, however I did panic. I stood immediately to my feet from my hiding spot, and I ran down the hallway, and I believe the only reason I wasn't grabbed by now is because the person chasing me had to get around the ottoman in the dark to follow me. I did what all children would do when they're afraid, and I bypassed the front door, the guest bedroom, the bathroom, and I ran to the farthest door down the hallway, my room. In all honesty, I probably wouldn't have been able to get the front door unlocked and opened in time, as it was right off the side of the couch. When I was 10, I got a bird for my birthday. He was a blue-fronted Amazon, and I named him Boo because it was October and close to Halloween. Boo had a very large iron cage. It could have been metal, but very large and sturdy and like 6 feet tall, and it was kept in my room. Despite the fact that Boo, like me, pretty much had the run of the house whenever he wanted. This information will become relevant later in the story. As I ran into the room, I slammed the door, shut and locked it. However, the lock was simply one of those little turn knobs that you can easily pop with a butter knife. I had barely gotten the door shut and locked when the person on the other side knocked on it. I have no idea why they knocked. If they did it to mock me or to scare me, but I knew in my heart that my little lock was not going to keep whoever it was on the other side out of my room. It didn't keep my mother out when we were arguing, and it certainly wouldn't stand up to brute force. I was panicking and on the verge of tears when the person started laughing. It was low, quiet, and because of that, it was even more frightening. It wasn't like manic laughter, but as if they were genuinely amused. It was the laughter that really frightened me, and I started heavily and hysterically crying and looking around my room to figure out what I could do. That was when I realized Boo's cage would fit almost perfectly between the door and the wall of my closet. The cage moved quietly on my carpeted floor, but as I pushed it into place, it scraped against the door and alerted whoever it was on the other side that I was trying to barricade myself in. Because suddenly, they threw themselves at my door, and you could hear the sound of the wood splintering and the door handle being twisted violently. My bird, who had been stirred by the movement awake, began literally screaming and flapping his wings. I might have screamed with him, but honestly, I don't remember screaming, I just remember being extremely terrified. Scared out of my mind, I crawled under my bed, and I waited. Several minutes passed, and the person eventually stopped attacking my door. Boo continued screaming even after he had stopped. Though being under my bed gave me no feelings of being secure, I didn't come out from under it because I simply had nowhere else to go. I thought about trying to go out the window, but I was afraid he might expect it, and therefore be waiting for me on the other side, and it was also several feet off the ground, as the house was built on a raised foundation. I remember laying under my bed, terrified, for what felt like hours. At some point I must have fallen asleep because I woke the next morning to daylight. The fear of what had happened came back to me as soon as I registered where I was and why, and scared that whoever had been in my house might still be there. I decided to crawl out the window and run to a neighbor since it was daylight outside, and therefore I felt less afraid. Crawling out this kind of window was a lot harder than it looks, and I did it less than gracefully, as I was not and still am not the most coordinated person. Once I was back on my feet, however, I carefully made my way around the house, and that's when I noticed that the back door was wide open. Scared but feeling braver now that I was outside and that it was morning, instead of pitch black night, I walked back up the steps and started peering inside. Seeing nothing out of the ordinary, meaning no terrifying man leering at me basically, I decided to go inside. Looking back, I cringe on how stupid this could have turned out, and I wish I would have told my younger self to make the smarter move and just go get help, but thankfully, no one was inside the house. I did a terrifying, heart-pounding room-to-room check, looking in closets and under beds, behind the couch, and anywhere I thought even a small child might be able to fit. I even popped the lock on my mom's bedroom so I could check it, and then relocked it afterwards. When I was positive there was no one there, I went back to lock the back door. I had left it open in case I needed to escape, and I noticed that the breaker box in the opposite wall was open. The main switch had been pulled. I flipped it back on, locked both locks on the back door, and checked all the windows and front door, and then called my mom, where I once again broke down crying hysterically. She called a coworker who came and stayed the entire day with me as they drove back. My mom still took random trips to Florida after that, but I always went with her from then on forward. This past New Year's Eve, I went away for the night with my two best friends and one of their moms. I was home for the holidays from college, and my friend Sarah invited me to go to Palm Springs to celebrate New Year's with her mom and our friend Rachel. I didn't have any other plans, so I decided to go with them. We went to a cool city about an hour from where we live that is big on shopping and resorts. We planned to have a pretty calm night, watch the ball drop at a block party downtown, and have a few drinks at the bar. Since we're on the West Coast, the ball drop is at 9, so at around 8, we ventured from our hotel, walking to the block party about a mile away. On the way, we passed by a very lively bar. We decided to stop by, and we spent 15 minutes dancing, but we didn't get any drinks. It was a gay bar, and Sarah and Rachel being gay, they were stoked on it and wanted to come back after the ball drop, even though it was about 90% men there. Continue on to the block party to get some dinner and a glass of champagne. The ball finally dropped and they had a DJ, so we spent about an hour there just dancing. After we got tired of it, we decided to head back to the bar and hang out there until midnight. Once we get there, Sarah's mom pays for a drink for each of us, but leaves soon after that because she was tired. It's about 10:30 at this point, and Sarah, Rachel, and I are enjoying our drinks and having fun dancing. Rachel tried some of my drink since it was one she hadn't had before. I constantly have my guard up when drinking in public, and I felt safe at this bar because it was 90% gay men, who I thought would not have an interest in me. I went back to the bar to get a second drink, and that's the last thing I remember. The rest I've gathered from Sarah and Rachel. Almost immediately after getting my second drink, I asked Rachel to go to the bathroom with me because I wasn't feeling well, even though I was completely fine 10 minutes before. Once in the bathroom, I just collapsed on the floor and I was almost unresponsive. Rachel, now worried, somehow drags my lifeless body out to where Sarah was waiting for us. Security, seeing my condition and assuming I was wasted, asked us to leave. Sarah and Rachel decided to take me back to the hotel about a half a mile away. By this point, I was unconscious and there were barely sounds escaping from my mouth. They saw someone leave the bar at the same time as us, who was walking near us, but they were preoccupied with trying to keep my lifeless body off the ground. At one point, I threw up all over myself, and the both of them, and the sidewalk. The next part of the story we had to get from Sarah because Rachel doesn't have much memory of this. Still struggling to carry me, the man they saw leave the bar approached them. He was hitting on Rachel, trying to get her to grab a drink with him. She was very agitated and told him to leave, and her friend needed help right now. He didn't take no for an answer and continued to follow us down the street and kept asking if we wanted to get drinks with him and if he can help carry me and such. A middle-aged woman witnessing this came up and told the man off. Something along the lines of, "Stop harassing these young women or I'm going to call the police." And thankfully he left after that. Next, by some miracle, an EMT and his wife enjoying the holiday ran into us on the street. He checked me out to make sure something wasn't majorly wrong and then carried me the rest of the way to my motel and into the room, since my friends could barely hold me up. They thanked him profusely and him and his wife left. This is where Rachel's memory kicks back in a little bit. 5 minutes later, they get a knock on the door and it's the EMT and his wife again. They came to let us know that a man followed us to the hotel, and they just saw him hop the gate and start to make his way to our room. My friends called hotel security, but they were unable to find him. My friends didn't get a glimpse of him, but I'm sure it was the same man from earlier. I spent the rest of the night vomiting everything in my body and dry heaving after that. I woke up the next morning in a pile of pillows and blankets on the bathroom floor. My last memory was at the bar getting a second drink, and my friends filled me in on everything that happened. Feeling like crap, I thought I must have drank way too much. But I've never blacked out before in my life, and the amount of drinks I had, only 2 in 2 hours, since I didn't get to my second at the bar, didn't add up to me being completely unconscious. We all decided that my first drink had to have been drugged, since Rachel had some of it and had no memory of our walk home, even though she was fully functional. I'm sure that the man that was talking to Rachel and then followed us back was the one that slipped something in my drink. To this day, I don't really know how I could have been slipped something, because I got my drink from the bar and I never set it down. My best guess was that it was already in the cup. Thankfully, I had a good friend and kind strangers protecting me that night. It keeps me up at night thinking what could have happened under different circumstances. A few years ago, when I was 19, I was coming home from watching the fireworks display on New Year's Eve. It was 3 a.m. when I reached my safe, family-friendly, nothing ever happens neighborhood. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and live in a posher and wealthier area. My friends wanted to call a taxi because we didn't want to wake our poor parents at this hour to drive us back home. But because of my stubbornness and insistence, we ended up taking the very long walk home. My friend Aiden was complaining most of the time. Guess I can't blame him. Rohan was just silent and compliant, and I was cheerful. When we reached almost my street, we split ways. The guys continued on their very long way walk home, which was way longer than mine, and I continued on mine. When I passed a little cake shop, I noticed a guy across the street. I only looked at him briefly, but something in the way he quickly looked up at me, almost in an interest, caught my attention. I hurried on anyways, because I'm usually paranoid about things, and 99% of the time, it's just me being paranoid. I turned onto my street, which was much darker than I had anticipated. This was about 3:15 a.m., mind you. As I passed the bowling club, I kept looking behind me just to make sure. It was getting quite cold and dark, so I started feeling creeped out. But there was no one behind me. No one anywhere as far as I could see. I was halfway down my street where the road dips down when I noticed something on the path in front of me. I couldn't tell what it was, and at the last minute, I stepped off the path onto the road to avoid it, because it looked like it might be a dead animal. And as I stepped onto the road, I turned slightly and saw that there was someone behind me. They weren't too close, but they weren't too far away either. And I remember my heart leapt into my throat because I hadn't seen them before. And for them to have gotten that close in that short space of time, something about it didn't sit well with me. When I told people about this later, they said that I should have been quite sus then. It was 3 a.m. in the morning, and you're quietly walking behind a girl, not even bothering to keep a safe distance. Like if you're really innocent, you would take measures to emphasize that, right? I couldn't see who it was, nor could I tell if it was male or female, because it was just a black figure to me. It was a very brief glimpse. I was scared though, so I whipped out my phone and started to call Aiden. I kept calling him, but silly Vodafone couldn't connect to him. So I tried to call Rohan, but he wouldn't pick up. I kept this up at least 5 times, getting increasingly anxious, but daring not to look behind me to see if he was still there. I'm glad I didn't, actually. I think I would have really freaked out if I had confirmed it. By that time, I'd reached my driveway and I hurried up it, thinking I was safe. But as I was halfway up, I looked over my shoulder again, just really quickly, and I saw the figure there again. The way I explain this next bit is going to be hard, because I was really confused and muddled, because on one hand, it may have looked like he was merely passing my driveway, but on the other hand, I am much more certain that it looked like he was just about to step onto the driveway, as if to walk up. And at that precise moment that I thought that, it occurred to me that he might be my brother, Jonathan, because no one else would bother walking up my driveway. Even if some guy was following me, it never occurred to me that he would really go to the lengths of going up my driveway as well. I thought I was completely safe because I had the advantage of having my house close by when he started following me. However, something about the build of this figure didn't seem like Jonathan to me, so I hurried on anyway. My beautiful, wonderful, amazing mother had stayed up to wait for me, and I am so glad because she opened the door for me as soon as I knocked. I hate to imagine what would have happened if I'd had to wait for a while. I went inside, but I left the second door open and the outside light on because I thought, Jonathan might be coming in any second now, but Mom was like, you can turn them off. Your brother came back 2 hours ago. I did get a little bit creeped out, but I just dismissed the thought because we are so quick to always think we're safe. I closed the door, shut off the light, and went to get a drink of water, and Mom went to bed. I went to my room to grab my clothes, and then went to the bathroom to take a shower, and I switched off the living room lights. This is sort of funny now that I think about it. Before I took a shower, I replied back to a message from Aiden, who was asking if I was home safe yet. I demanded to know why he hadn't picked up his phone, and then I told him I was creeped out for a few minutes, but I was okay now. Then as I showered, I actually thought about that figure. I wasn't too convinced that it was following me, but my mind did teeter into wondering this or that. In any case, I remember thinking that it was okay because I was safe now. At the near end of my shower, I heard something at the window. It didn't sound like the usual creaking or bumping of an old house. The way I described it to other people was like the sound of someone resting their hands against the window to steady themselves. It sounded really unnatural. I know because it caught my attention straight away and I immediately jumped to the possibility that there might be someone outside. And I know that only a really strange sound would make me do what I did next, which was to turn off the water and crouch under the window, hiding and waiting. I waited for quite some time, too scared to move. For a few minutes, but there was nothing, so I gingerly crawled out, still too scared to stand up properly, and I switched off the bathroom lights. But then it was impossible for me to dry myself and dress myself, so I turned on the heater light, which is much smaller and dimmer. But as I did that, I noticed at the window that there was a very small blue light there. That certainly didn't belong there. The way I can describe it now, it was almost like a keypad of a phone lit up. I was so scared, but I switched off the heater light as well and backed into the corner. My towel wrapped around me and I waited. It seemed like a long time that I waited, too scared to unlock the door and move because I knew it would make a lot of noise. As I waited in the pitch darkness, several blue lights came on outside the window, like a few. It became very bright and they were moving it, trying to shine it through the window. Now that I think about it, it had to be a phone, but I'm not sure because there were a few lights. But that did it for me because I practically bolted for my mom. I unlocked the door and went into my parents' room, trembling like a leaf and gibbering that there was someone outside the bathroom window. I was clearly very upset. So Mom ushered me around, trying to find a safe room for me to change into. Dad apparently heard the footsteps hurrying back down the driveway, and I'm glad he did, because the situation feels so surreal to me now that I'm not even sure if it really happened. Maybe I imagined it all. But this is confirmation that it wasn't just my imagination. I was so shaky, and I slid into bed and couldn't sleep until morning. And even when it was morning, I was terrified, especially when I heard Dad leave the house and go into the backyard. So that was the lesson I learned. I'm never walking home again at night. I'm even a bit worried during the daytime now. We never did find out who it was. People wonder if it was the same person I'd passed earlier, but for some reason I didn't think so. My brother doesn't think so either. This past New Year's was mine and my boyfriend's 4-year anniversary. We typically don't do much, so this year we decided to make it special by planning a romantic getaway. At the time, the two of us were living in Seattle and we wanted to rent a cabin in a snowy small town for the weekend. We found a cabin on Airbnb with a hot tub and we were sold. The cabin was, of course, the last house on the road. To get to it, you had to drive down a small remote private road that ended in a roundabout. Off the roundabout was a long uphill driveway leading up to our cabin. We got to the cabin and it was snowy and beautiful. The cabin itself sat on top of a garage and you needed to take stairs on the back side of the property to get to the front door. When we got inside, there was a booklet with all of the cabin's info outlined. The book said that during the snowy season, don't be surprised if their contracted snowplowers showed up to clear off the driveway. Okay, sounds good. So we unpacked and realized that there was no service on either of our phones, but the booklet told us that there was a landline in the cabin if we needed anything. We spent the first night by the fire playing board games and drinking wine. The weekend was exactly what we needed. We planned to spend the next day in town, and that night I had booked us a reservation for a nice dinner. We were gone almost all day, only returning briefly to get dressed up to enjoy some good food. Dinner was great, and we were excited to head back to the cabin for some champagne hot tubbing. While at dinner, the temperature had dropped and it snowed for the first time that day, coating everything in a fresh layer of powder. We drove down the private road and got to the driveway. At that point, my boyfriend stopped the car, headlights shining in front, and asked if I noticed the new tire tracks. I looked at the driveway, hoping to quickly disregard the new tire tracks, but there they were. Immediately, we remembered that the snowplowers could have stopped by, but the issue was we saw the tire tracks because of the snow, and who plows in the dark? We also knew that once we were at the cabin, we had no service on our cell phones, so we figured we would head back into town and message our Airbnb hosts and ask them if them or any of their friends had stopped by. We waited for a while in town for a reply from our host, but we didn't hear back. We could have called, but at that point it was past 10 and we didn't want to be bad guests. We figured we blew the whole thing out of proportion and might as well head back to the cabin. After all, I am big into true crime and spooky subreddits and horror movies, so I was probably just psyching myself out. My boyfriend drove us back, and this time we actually drove up the driveway. Towards the top of the hill part of the driveway, though, I noticed something. My stomach dropped as I noticed footprints on the property. We backed down the driveway and took a closer look to see if there were any more footprints. From what it looked like, someone had drove up the driveway, then reversed down, parked, and then got out of the car and walked all around the property. The property was quite large with tons of trees and brush, and we knew that these footprints could go anywhere. The moment we saw footprints, we decided to call the police. We figured it was better safe than sorry, and we would just have the officer go onto the property with us to check everything out. We drove down the road till we got service, called the police, and waited for their arrival. The policeman showed up and we followed him onto the property. The officer scanned the property and determined there was no one out there. Obviously, we were a little bit shaken up and very embarrassed. We thanked the officer as he left. Needless to say, neither of us wanted to sit in the hot tub in the dark woods after what happened. Instead, we locked the doors and watched a movie, champagneless. We were both tired from the day and passed out pretty quickly. At 3 a.m., we both woke up on the couch with the TV on and all the lights, laughing about how the night didn't turn out as planned. As my boyfriend went to brush his teeth, we heard a noise. It sounded mechanical and only lasted a few seconds. We looked at each other and froze. The garage door. There are very few reasons that someone would need to open the garage door of a guest-occupied Airbnb at 3 in the morning. Like I said, we woke up with all of the lights on and the cabin had lots of windows. We knew that if someone was outside, they knew that we were here and that they could see us. I immediately grabbed the landline and dialed 911 once again. We sat crouched in the Airbnb praying for the police to arrive. We knew that whoever had made those tracks was still on the property, and this time they were making noise. As I sat talking to the operator, we heard a bang on our balcony as if someone was throwing something up onto it. I was losing my absolute shit when the operator told me the police were nearby. All of a sudden, they were there. We saw the police lights and watched them search everything. And then soon we heard banging on the door. It was the police, and we were okay now. At the door were 2 policemen, one in front of us and one a little behind, kind of kicking around the snow and looking at the ground. I immediately noticed the police officer in the back as the officer that did the initial check on the property. The officer told us that not only was the garage door shut, but it was locked. And again, there was no signs of someone on the property. We discussed leaving, but the officer said the road conditions were too dangerous at that time of night. I looked at the officer who had to come out to the property twice, and I felt I had deeply disappointed him. My boyfriend and I went back inside, again locking all the doors, and we tried to sleep. The next day, we were leaving, and while we survived the night, I didn't feel right in the cabin anymore. It was forever the spooky cabin in my head, and I just wanted to leave. As we packed, we heard the same noise that we heard at 3 a.m. That's when I had the realization that it was the heater. All that time, it was just the heater in the garage making this noise. My boyfriend looked at me and immediately said, "You need to give up your murder shows," and then walked away. As for the banging on the balcony, it was just a perfectly timed fall of a pine cone. I promise I'm not paranoid. I think back on this story a lot, and I'm embarrassed about how little came of it, but also incredibly grateful for the same reason. My sister is a student in South London and has lived in some pretty awful student accommodation during her time studying. This particular house that she lived in had trouble with the front door lock. It was just off a very busy main road. She had 4 other housemates and her room was in the attic, which obviously is the setup for all creepy happenings, but in reality was a really nice conversion. On this particular evening, she was planning on heading out later to celebrate New Year's Eve locally with her friends. She was in the house alone while getting ready and had left her room to put makeup on in the bathroom. While she was doing this, she heard a really loud knock on her front door and some scuffling outside. Assuming it was one of her housemates coming back to grab something that they had forgotten, she headed downstairs to let them in. As she got close to the door, she heard voices that she didn't recognize and could see the shapes of 2 people through the frosted glass. We lived in London all of our lives and are both probably quick to not trust the situation. So she kept quiet and slowly made her way back upstairs, when suddenly the door literally flies open with a huge bang, and a man and a woman come flying in. She said that she could practically smell the alcohol on these 2 from a floor up, and from the way they were talking, she could tell they were totally off their faces on a shit ton of drugs too. As they immediately start to force entry into the first bedroom on the ground floor and grab anything they can find, my sister in a panic makes a dash up the staircase to her attic room to stay out of their way and out of sight until she can figure out what to do next. In her room, she finds her phone and immediately calls the police. She has to tell the operator what's going on as quietly as possible and is told that the police will be there in about 12 minutes. She told me that this 12 minutes was the longest and most terrifying 12 minutes of her life. As she hears the banging and smashing noises from downstairs starting to move up the house, it is of course at this moment that she remembers the staircase which leads up to the attic is still down, as she hadn't had time to pull it up behind her in her frenzied dash to her room. To counter this frankly appalling realization, she moves every item of furniture over the trap door and then sits on top of it all to stop them gaining entry if they try. As she sits there too afraid to even breathe and her heartbeat racing in her ears, she hears them kick down the very last door in the house right next to her staircase. The woman is screaming and smashing things up, and the man is shouting instructions about what items to steal. These total dickheads were so confident and off their faces they don't even bother to be quiet, which makes them that much scarier. She hasn't got a doubt that if a person confronted them or they found someone in the house, they would become very violent. As it becomes obvious to both them and her that the last place to try is her room, she hears the most beautiful sounds anyone has ever heard, as the yell of "Police" echoes up the stairs. These 2 weirdos might be out of it, but they know what that means. The guy just clean jumps out of the 2nd floor window, lands on the shed and escapes over the garden fence, but the woman can't figure out which way to run and is caught by the police, screaming, biting, scratching, and swearing. My sister, sitting on top of the chest of drawers over her trap doors, in exactly the same position she has been for those seemingly never-ending 12 minutes, can only bring herself to open the trap door once the police tell her over and over that it's safe to do so. The devastation of the house is shocking and makes her so grateful that she had a place to hide, but also compounds how terrifying it is to have to sit helpless and trapped in the attic. She speaks to the police and gives her statement, and then calls my mom in a total wreck. She goes to stay with my mom and little sister for a few days while it's sorted out, then moves in with her boyfriend, who is also a student at the same uni. She only returns to collect her stuff, which at least is still around. Everyone else, door locked or unlocked, had their valuables stolen. This story strikes me of total dread and is probably one of the scariest things I've heard. Imagining what it must have been like for her makes me feel sick. The man never got caught, and the landlord, who never fixed their front door lock before the break-in, after being repeatedly asked, tried to make my sister keep paying her rent after she moved out, as per the contract agreement. Well, screw that. She gave him an elaborate array of places he could shove his contract, and I'm pleased to report he must have chosen one of them because that was the end of that.